for addressing this issue in the state of California, because no state's more impacted by extremes than the state of California. What more evidence do I need to give you than your 90-degree weather down here in the last week and the 37, 8, 9, 10 days that we have not had any significant rain in the state of California. Again, February being allegedly, traditionally, the most wet month of the year. And so we put $37.6 billion in our budget to address the issue of climate change. That's nation-level budgeting. One of the areas we focused on is hydrogen. One of the areas we're focusing more attention to is green hydrogen, particularly as it relates to manufacturing and large industry. And so I want to just acknowledge what Southern California Gas did today as a step in the right direction. They're promoting something this state continues to promote and will be promoting more over in the next number of years. And so we're grateful by that example. We need to see more of it. Not only from them, but across the spectrum. But the issue of addressing heavy industry, not just residential solar, not just wind, not just a conversion of electric vehicles, but really going after big industry is critical in advancing our efforts of low-carbon green growth.
Hi, Governor. Thanks again for taking our questions. I'm Tom Waite with CBS Los Angeles. I was wondering if you're aware there's a bit of a feud going on between a couple of the LA County supervisors and the LA County Health Department, where the supervisors are upset that the county is not in line with the state in terms of the indoor mask mandate. Obviously, the state lifted theirs, but LA County still has theirs in place. So what's your position on that feud? What should the county be doing, and how would you resolve it?
Yeah, well, I don't know enough about the details of the feud to get in the middle of it at the moment, but forgive me in that respect. But look, as a former county supervisor, I've long maintained, and you've heard me say this on multiple occasions, localism is determinative. And I'll remind you, and as I do often, but it's important, California is the size of 21 state populations combined. There's just nothing else like it. If you put a circle around just LA County, it's a small dot in California. It's bigger. I mean, you put a map, 2/3 of the rest of the states are not as big as just the county. So I deeply understand the nuances and complexities. There's 58 counties, 476 cities, different geographic challenges, opportunities, 80+ cities just in the county, different approaches, large, smaller cities. So it's understandable there'll be some differences of opinion. The state provided that support long ago in the beginning of this pandemic, and we're maintaining that in the Smarter Plan, that we want to allow that local flexibility. We think it's critical. I'm very pleased with the state mandate that was lifted as relates to indoor mask wearing. The overwhelming majority of counties, I think anywhere from 52, 3 or 4 of the 58 have aligned with California, and I anticipate others will follow suit. But some counties, and obviously LA is one of them, may take a little bit more time, but I'm confident they'll get there very, very shortly.
Hi, Bo Yarborough, Southern California News Group. Circling back to the green hydrogen thing, do you think the new pipeline is going to impact the closing of Aliso Canyon? Well,
that's a good question, open-ended question. I just learned about this, and obviously the application will be in front of the Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC. I'll have a chance to review that. Obviously, the commissioners will take a look at that. But we want to move forward with closing of Aliso Canyon. We've been very crystal clear about that. And in fact, I expressed some frustration that it wasn't happening fast enough. So I'm hopeful that this will advance that effort. And I think there's some wisdom to this move by SoCalGas, because I think it's an acknowledgement of the future. The future is much more bright for a company that adapts to the future. And I think they're understanding that they're an infrastructure company, perhaps more than they are a gas company. And I think that's a preferred pathway. And so I'm not here on their behalf as a fiduciary, but I am here on behalf of all of us, trying to clean our air and deal with the extremes, extreme heat, drought, and wildfires. And we need to move past fossil fuels. We need to move past worrying about what Putin does and the impact of our gas prices, and move past our dependence on gas and oil. And I think this is at least a positive step in that direction.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Shelby Nelson with KTLA. Most of my questions have been answered, but I just wanted to go back to that question about students and masking. Specifically here in the Inland Empire, we have seen kids and parents protesting. I know you answered some of those questions, but what would you say to parents that are really just enraged seeing these huge events with thousands of people not wearing masks, and yet they still have to send their kids to school with masks?
Yeah, here's what I'd say. Look, I understand that, but I also understand this. California, 92, almost 93% of all adults 18 and over have received at least one dose. 71 million doses total in the state of California. Of all Californians eligible, we're about 74% have fully received their dosing. Kids, that's not the case. Sadly, it's 29% of 5 to 11-year-olds are fully vaccinated, not 75. You know, we were able to avoid, as an example, what Texas and Florida could not avoid, and that was a substantial number of kids, pediatric hospitalizations. We have a substantially lower number than those states because of the approach we've taken. That's why we're not alone in that approach. Many other states still maintain their mask requirements, as I noted, 13, I believe, plus the District of Columbia. 8 have announced an end date. We will do the same, and that's what I would tell those parents that are concerned. We'll do the same in just 11 days, and we're trying to do our best to keep their kids safe and healthy, keep them safely in school, and we've outperformed many states because of that, and we believe the masking has helped, and we believe there's no substitute for in-person instruction in that respect. So, look, this is challenging for all of us, and I'm not naive to that critique. As I said, I'm a parent of 4. My own kids have strong opinions, not just their parents, not just parents across the state, but we're very, very close to an announcement that I believe is an appropriate one under the circumstances.
Hi, Governor Newsom. I'll be the last question here. I'm with 91.9 KVCR out of San Bernardino. Could you say in around 30 seconds why this announcement should matter to the common Californians?
Is that all you have on the tape? 30 seconds? Why does this matter? Because I think people are looking forward to turning the page. People are desperate to move past this crisis mode that we've been in for the last few years. People are desperate to get back to whatever semblance of normalcy they vaguely may remember from a few years prior. But they also need to know that we have their back, we're going to keep them safe, and we're going to stay on top of this, that we're not walking away from this pandemic and this disease. We're not walking away from the virus because the virus continues to change and mutate. And we will change our approach as the virus changes its mutations, its lineages and sublineages. And I want folks to know no other state's better prepared to do that and keep them safe and healthy than the state of California. Let me thank all of you, and let me also just acknowledge we've seen an 88% decline in Omicron cases just in the last number of weeks, 48% decompression of our hospital system. Now is the time to move forward, to turn the page, maintain vigilance. This smarter plan, we think, is a good and appropriate pathway to do just that. Again, I want to thank all of you that were here to help us with this plan, and we look forward to updating and adapting to the changes in store. Thank you all very, very much.
have encouraged corporations to move production overseas. It's cost us millions of jobs, especially in the states of Pennsylvania and Ohio. It's contributing to our supply chain problems today. It's time to bring these supply chains back home. The House and Senate have passed bills to spur domestic manufacturing and research and development. They will allow us to better compete with countries like China. They'd support the production of key inputs like semiconductors. We should put a comprehensive bill on the President's desk soon. We also took an important step to speed up our supply chain by passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill to improve our roads and our bridges and ports, making it easier and more efficient for American manufacturers to get products to market. As important as these steps are, government is not the only actor here. Corporate consolidation is reducing competition, giving consumers fewer choices and workers fewer options. Nobody explains better in the meatpacking industry than my colleague from Montana, Senator Tester, what's happened there. Too often corporations increase prices while cutting an even larger check for executives and shareholders. The Wall Street Journal tells us that two-thirds of the largest publicly traded companies reported larger profits in 2021 than they did in 2019. In recent weeks, CEOs have bragged to Wall Street about their ability to increase prices on consumers. Let's be clear, raising prices is a choice, is a decision that corporations make. They could make a different choice. They could reduce the amount of stock buybacks. Millionaire executives could actually take a bit of a pay cut or even just get a smaller raise this year. But there's nothing forcing them to make a better choice because there isn't enough competition in the economy. We need an economy that works for everyone, not just those at the top. We can't declare the recovery complete until all workers can find a job that pays them fair wages, that treats them with dignity, and that allows them to keep up with the cost of living. Today, we'll hear from all three members of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Chair Rouse, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Boucher. These are skilled economists who understand that behind all the charts and models and tables are real people with hopes, dreams, and ambition. As Chair Rouse said in January, the actions that the Biden administration have taken led, quote, to unprecedented improvement in our economy and important investments made in its future productive capacity. I look forward to hearing more about this year of unprecedented growth, the current state of the economy, and plans to continue this expansion. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to start by observing it's a little bit rich to be lectured by the chairman about not attending a markup of nominees when the chairman personally led the Democratic boycott of the Senate Finance Committee markup of 2 Trump nominees. There are several other Democrats on the committee who participated in that boycott. I guess what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. It's also rich to hear wailing and gnashing of teeth about vacancies on the Fed board and this newfound Democratic concern over inflation. First of all, I and my Republican colleagues have been on record for well over a year warning about inflation risks, warning about the excessive spending. Democrats criticized us for wanting to normalize interest rates and Fed policy. And yet here our Democratic colleagues are pushing for yet another inflation-fueling spending blowout bill. Fact is, the Fed is fully functional. The FOMC has 9 of its 12 members in place. They could raise rates today if they wanted to. They could do it tomorrow. They could do it at any time. But what's really ironic is that it's the chairman's decision not to move 5 nominees forward. We made it clear, I made it clear last week to the chairman, repeatedly, publicly, and privately, we are perfectly happy to vote on 5 of the 6 nominees. That would be 4 Fed governors and the director of the FHFA. If we did, actually most of them would get considerable Republican support. They'd move on. And if there were a concern about vacancies on the Fed, then the chairman could fix that very quickly. He chooses not to. He prefers to have the vacancies. That's his choice. It's also interesting how some of my Democratic colleagues have been so passionate about ending the revolving door. In fact, you could argue some have practically made a career out of railing against the revolving door, where people go from a powerful government regulator to go work for the industry that they regulated, they enrich themselves, and then maybe they come back to do it for another loop. Is there a more archetypical example than Ms. Raskin? Senator Warren recently tweeted called Randy Quarles corrupt because after he left the Fed, he went back to the firm, the private equity firm that he had founded himself. So I guess it's corrupt if a Republican does that, but the rules don't seem to apply in the other directions. The chairman said that the candidates answered the questions. Let me be very clear. Ms. Raskin was far less than candid with us. She failed to disclose that she even was a director of Reserve Trust. She failed to disclose the $1.5 million she made for that service. She failed to disclose hundreds of pages of writing, hours of speeches. When she was asked how did she get on the board of Reserve Trust in the first place, she said she couldn't recall, which is odd because the founder and chairman says in an article in today's Wall Street Journal he's known the Raskins for decades. When Ms. Raskin was asked if she ever contacted the Fed on behalf of Reserve Trust, first she evaded the question repeatedly, and then eventually she replied by saying she couldn't recall. Well, that's funny, because the Kansas City Federal Reserve president recalled the conversation very well. The chairman of the Federal Reserve Trust, recalled the conversation. He wasn't even part of it. But we're supposed to believe that Ms. Raskin just couldn't recall. And let me remind everybody why this is important. Reserve Trust is a fintech company. It's based in Colorado and applied for something that's extremely valuable, a master account at the Fed. To my knowledge, there's not a single fintech in America that had gotten that. And unsurprisingly, they were denied. Their application was turned down. Then Ms. Raskin, on the board, called the Fed. And shortly thereafter, the Fed does a 180-degree reversal and approves the master account. And to the best of my knowledge, as of today, there's a grand total of one fintech in America that has a master account with the Fed, and it is Reserve Trust. So we asked an obvious question. Why the reversal? Why the 180-degree change? What changed? First, we got stonewalled. Then we finally get a partial answer from the Reserve Bank of Kansas. And let me just quote one sentence that summarizes it. Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas says, after this denial, and that's a reference to the denial of the master account application of the Reserve Trust. After this denial, RTC changed its business model and the Colorado Division of Banking reinterpreted the state's law in a manner that meant RTC met the definition of a depository institution. That's from the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. My problem with that is on Tuesday night, the Colorado Division of Banking says that's not true. And this is what they said, and I quote, "We consider the statement that the division reinterpreted state law as a misrepresentation of our practice." So it remains entirely unclear what happened here. All we know is that Ms. Raskin was in the middle of it. The firm on whose board she sat applied for a very, very valuable account with the Fed. They were turned down. She intervenes. They get approved, and we can't get an explanation of what happened here. Is that fair to all the other fintechs across America that would also like to have a master account, and they've been turned down? How is that fair to anybody? And how is this committee doing its job if we don't insist on getting some answers to this question? But we get stonewalled. We get answers from the nominee that she can't recall, and we get basically nothing from the Fed. So, Mr. Chairman, it's your choice if you want to continue to preclude the possibility of having 4 nominees from the Fed confirmed and the FHA director. We are quite happy to process those nominees. But we want answers before we vote on Ms. Raskin. And let me just close with a quote justifying a boycott of recent markup of nominees. And I quote, "By refusing to demand honest, transparent information about the business dealings of these nominees, the committee failed to do its job on behalf of the American people." That is Sherrod Brown, February 1st, 2017.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I don't want this to be back and forth because we have witnesses here for a real reason, but let me just say 2 quick things. One is our not showing up in the Finance Committee and the Help Committee to discuss and actually ultimately vote on two, as it turned out, particularly one corrupt cabinet nominee, Dr. Price, who was in office only about 4 or 5 months and resigned under a scandal, did not stop the committee from voting. It was a protest that they had not answered nearly enough of our questions. They didn't give the kind of response that Sarah Bloom Raskin, Governor Raskin, and others gave, the fulsome kinds of answers they gave to dozens and dozens of questions. So we were protesting that, but didn't block a vote because the majority could still go ahead. That's the difference in this, and the Banking Committee has never done that. Second issue on voting on four noms, and I know that's Senator Toomey's contention over and over. He knows, we all know, that that would set a precedent. If the ranking member can decide based on answers to questions that a nominee gave. I don't like the answers on climate change, especially, as one that has offended many Republican members. Then if a ranking member can say, I don't like the answers to the questions, then simply withhold a quorum, it means the ranking members then choose whom we're going to vote on. So any ranking member, whether it's finance or banking or veterans or any other committee, can simply say, I didn't like his answers, I didn't like her answers, we're not going to show up to vote. Then essentially the ranking member determines whom we're going to vote on. So we're voting on all 5 of these Fed noms. We're voting on FHFA. They're all very qualified. That's our intention when we get back in March. To our witnesses, Dr. Rouse, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Boucher, we welcome you to the committee. I believe this will be our first hearing in a long time, as long as I can remember, with the full CEA before the committee. Chair Rouse, please begin your testimony. Thank you for joining us.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me and my colleagues Heather Boucher and Jared Bernstein here to testify today. Just over a year ago, President Biden entered office with a full agenda, a pledge not only to fight the pandemic and support economic recovery, but also to rebuild our economy for sustainable and more widely shared growth. Success was not preordained. The country faced a still raging pandemic, a weak economic recovery, and historic job loss. Thanks to the collective efforts of the administration, Congress, and the Federal Reserve, we have been able to recover with strength and speed. And importantly, we have begun to lay the groundwork for an economy that is stronger, more resilient, and more equitable. Over the last year, millions of Americans have gained protection from the worst of COVID-19. Businesses have been able to resume activity, and children are back at their school desks. Economic recovery has been strong. In 2021, GDP grew faster than it has in almost 40 years, and the U.S. job market gained 6.7 million jobs. Unemployment is down to 4%, years earlier than projected. Child poverty is likely to be reduced by almost 40% in 2021. The American Rescue Plan was a critical component of this recovery. It served as an insurance policy to address the uncertainty of a global pandemic and support the economy as the virus and the tools to tamp it down evolved. The emergency measures worked, resulting in a robust economic turnaround. Families and businesses have had the means and resources to cope with in the short term. Ultimately, workers and small businesses have avoided the lasting damage we typically see when economic crises are allowed to linger. But as President Biden has made abundantly clear, helping Americans weather the pandemic is simply part one of his economic vision. The administration's strategy encompasses what the President and Treasury Secretary Yellen have called modern supply-side economics. That is, we must make investments in our economy to boost labor supply, raise productivity, reduce inequality, and create strong, sustainable growth. The bipartisan infrastructure law is a historic step towards realizing that vision, providing long overdue investment in our nation's roads, bridges, water systems, and broadband infrastructure. We commend the bipartisan work of many on this committee for making these necessary investments, and know your governors, mayors, and constituents are grateful. Unlike the American Rescue Plan, which was short-run relief designed to be spent out over the course of the pandemic emergency, the infrastructure law will span out across the country over years, building and strengthening the foundation our economy needs to increase productive capacity. Other administrative actions this year will also contribute to long-term economic growth. Examples include the whole-of-government approach to increasing competition in markets, addressing climate change, and fostering greater equity. Of course, challenges remain. The gains in our economy have taken place against the backdrop of a once-in-a-century pandemic economy, where what we know about downturns and recoveries has been tested. Vigilance is required to ensure we do not backslide when curveballs like Omicron come our way. And Americans are feeling the pinch of inflation at the pump, in grocery stores, and in the marketplace. The pandemic itself has been a major driver. Consumers have shifted their spending from services to goods, and global supply chains have been severely tested. A lack of workers has stymied the supply of goods and services as well. In the near term, the principal tools to curb inflation rest with the Federal Reserve, which is why it is critical to confirm the 5 highly qualified nominees now. The administration also has some tools it can deploy, as demonstrated in recent actions to improve supply chain disruptions at the ports and increase capacity of the trucking industry. In the longer term, we must make real investments. Be that in our roads and bridges or people and ideas. Sustainable growth will only come about if we are able to increase economic capacity and allow more Americans to participate productively in our economy. The economic challenges of 2022 must, of course, be met, but we must also lay a foundation for future generations. In doing so, we must create an economy that rewards work, not wealth. The administration's economic agenda aims to ensure that those in the middle class who have been largely left out of the economic investments for the past 40 years will finally benefit, ensuring that growth is more broadly shared. We need Congress to act on the president's full economic agenda to achieve these goals, providing necessary funding to continue to address the pandemic and keep the economy functioning, passing USICA to bolster competition and build resiliency into the market, enabling the energy transition to curb climate change, and making Build Back Better a reality so that families can afford the needs of everyday life like prescription drugs and childcare. As noted by 17 Nobel Prize-winning economists, these long-term investments not only build a stronger economy, but also ease long-term inflationary pressures. President Biden's economic vision is predicated on the fact that the economic status quo has not worked for all Americans. For decades, it has largely benefited those at the very top. We share his vision for a stronger and more equitable economic future for our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 questions for you, and I hope to get, if answers are short enough, to Dr. Boucher and then Dr. Bernstein. Chair Rouse, many American workers and families are concerned about high prices at the grocery store and the gas station. What's your assessment of inflation right now? What's the best way to fight it?
Okay, I guess I'm still on. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So we understand that inflation is affecting consumers' pocketbooks with higher prices at the pump, grocery stores, for various goods. Our view is we expect inflation to moderate over the coming year because we believe that the factors that have been causing high inflation will begin to ease as COVID cases gradually decrease. You know, inflation is fundamentally a mismatch between supply and demand, which has partially reflected a change in demand as consumers have shifted their spending to goods. So what we need to do is we have to, to accommodate demand, we know that we have to have increased supply. Producers have been increasing their prices because of the constrained supply. So we need to ensure that the ports are strong and that we have robust investment in our infrastructure. I will say in the short term, this really is in the purview of the Federal Reserve, which is why confirming the nominees is so very important. The administration is doing what it can to increase supply chains, to get more workers back to work, including truckers with apprenticeship programs and other efforts. In the medium term, the competition agenda is so very important because we know concentration in concentrated markets that gives supply, that gives some price pressure for firms. It reduces innovation. It can cause lower wages for workers. Importantly, the president's economic vision of investing in infrastructure, in people and ideas is really the long-term solution, building economic capacity for addressing longer-term price pressures.
Thank you. My friend and colleague, Rob Portman, called the bipartisan infrastructure bill a deflationary bill, that it will help drive down prices for American consumers. Do you agree with that?
What I agree is that the bipartisan infrastructure law it makes critical investments in our roads, ports, bridges, broadband, takes lead out of pipes. Those are important investments which increase our economic capacity. By increasing capacity, we can accommodate more demand, and so therefore it helps to ease inflationary pressures.
Thank you. Dr. Boucher, your work as an economist is focused on how we fix problems with inequality in the economy, whether by race, class, or gender, or even where you live. The stock market always seems to bounce back first from a downturn, while the lowest paid workers who experience the biggest job losses are also the slowest to reap the benefits of the economic growth that they essentially created. How do we ensure that economic recovery reaches all workers, from steel workers in rural Ohio to newly unionizing baristas at Starbucks, and not just those at the top?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. That's a great question, a good place to start. You know, the President has been very clear on this issue. In fact, in his address to Congress last year, he said that his economic agenda focuses on building an economy from the bottom up and middle out, and really making sure that we see strong, stable, and shared economic growth. And that is why it was so important when he first came into office to focus on getting our economy, addressing the pandemic and getting us back to full employment. That's why the American Rescue Plan was so important. There's charts behind us that show some of the successes, getting 6.7 million workers into jobs. And importantly, many of the gains, particularly in wages, have been felt by workers at the bottom end of the wage spectrum. So when you get folks back to work, it has this pulling up effect. Now, of course, that hasn't solved all of the issues around inequities, and I want to point out a couple other things that we focused on early on. One thing that the administration focused on was making sure that the PPP program, the Payroll Protection Program, actually went to those who needed it the most. And there's now research showing that actually once the administration came into office, more business owners of color and women were able to access that program. So that's one way. And what that shows is that you actually need to have a focused attention, which is why President Biden has, as Chair Rouse said, these whole-of-government approaches to equity, to addressing climate change, and to issues around market structure and competition. Because it is only through making sure that all of our policies are focused on both being inclusive and making sure that those at the top are not able to be unduly rewarded, will we be able to have that kind of strong, stable, shared growth. I want to just end with a couple of notes to echo what Chair Rouse said. I mean, certainly the bipartisan infrastructure law is an important down payment on equity in a variety of ways, but I cannot stress enough how important Build Back Better is, that more fulsome agenda to make sure that we are addressing the needs around care and climate across the U.S. economy.
Thank you, Dr. Shea. Dr. Bernstein, quickly, and sorry, there's not a lot of time left. The pandemic revealed long-standing weaknesses in our supply chain, as you know. What should Congress, the administration, do to make supply chains more resilient and bring prices down for consumers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As was mentioned, the administration is already engaged in working with the ports and working with the trucking sector, doing all we can to help ameliorate some of these pressures that are showing up in our elevated inflationary reads. The ports of LA and Long Beach process 40% of the nation's containerized imports. They actually broke their 2018 record last year for annualized imports by 13%. The number of containers sitting on the docks that for 9 days has come down by 60%, and so on. In the interest of time, perhaps we'll be able to get back to this. But underscoring what both of my colleagues said, by investing in the nation's infrastructure, whether it's roads, bridges, electric vehicles, climate, we help to strengthen supply chains by onshoring some critical capacity that is now very much, which are very much dependent on offshore arrangements. We also help to bolster not just supply chains, but build in the kind of resiliency that's clearly been missing. Certainly, microchips are a great example of that, and USICA is a very important policy solution in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2019, wages were rising, and they were rising faster than prices. And wages were rising faster for low-income workers than they were for upper-income workers. So we had workers, unemployment reached record lows also, and workers were able to improve their standard of living because their income was rising faster than their expenses. Now we're in a situation where wages are rising, but prices are rising faster. And the reality is, for most workers, they're falling behind because the cost of the things they need to buy every week is going up faster than any increase in their income. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics in February 10th summarized it pretty neatly. They say, and I quote, real average hourly earnings decreased 1.7%, seasonally adjusted, from January 21 to January 22. The change in real average hourly earnings, combined with a decrease of 1.4% in the average work week, resulted in a 3.1% decrease in real average weekly earnings over this period. I know that's not the intention, but isn't it true, let's start with Dr. Rouse, that most low and middle income workers have experienced a bigger rise in the cost of the things they need to buy than in their incomes?
Well, I appreciate the concern very much, Senator, and we're all very concerned about inflation and appreciate that is, the purview of the Fed in the short term, and it's important that we have a full slate of governors. I just would like to point out the chart on the far right.
Okay, I'm sorry, but look, we all know that the number of governors is adequate to do whatever they need to do about inflation. So let's not go there.
Okay, so let's look at this chart on the far.
But can you confirm the simple fact that for most workers, wages are not rising as fast as prices?
So some recent estimates by economists Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman suggest that actually, if we look at the bottom 50% of workers, that their market income before taxes and benefits is greater now than it was in Q4 2019. And you can look, if you look after taxes and benefits, that they're actually ahead. So
is your position, so we saw the number of 7.5% as the most recent annual rate of inflation. We also know that low and middle income people have a worse experience than that because they pay a disproportionate amount of their income for things that are rising more rapidly than 7.5, like gasoline, like groceries. Are you telling me that you think that the average worker in America is more than keeping up with inflation?
So what we know is that look, inflation is not, we do not want to see this level of inflation going forward. And that's why the president is focused on doing what he can. The Federal Reserve is likely to adjust how its posture has been towards inflation. But we do know that household balance sheets, because of the efforts of the federal government, the Federal Reserve, have been maintained through this pandemic, which is what is reflected in this chart on the left.
Okay, I'm surprised that we can't candidly acknowledge the obvious. Wages are not growing as fast as prices for the large majority of workers, and these workers are falling behind. Yes, if you have a lot of accumulated assets, they've appreciated in value, and you're probably doing fine. But the Americans I'm concerned about in this case are those who don't have a huge accumulated. Let me ask a question of Dr. Boucher. Contrary to what I occasionally hear, it is an objective fact that the 2017 tax reform made the American income tax code more progressive. We lowered the burden for everybody, and in the process, changing rules shifted the percentage, the largest percentage, to more upper income people. My understanding is the administration supports legislation that would raise the SALT deduction from the $10,000 limit that we put for rich people to deduct their high state and local taxes to $80,000. I don't know any working class people who have $80,000 worth of state and local taxes. And yet, it looks like the administration supports that. My understanding is from joint tax that the top 10% of income earners would get about 88% of the benefit of lifting the SALT cap. So why does the administration want to have this huge giveaway to wealthy people who choose to live in expensive jurisdictions?
So the administration has not come out with a position on the SALT tax at this point, and I'm not here to negotiate that with you today. But
I'm sorry,
what I can tell you...
Did you not endorse the Build Back Better legislation? Doesn't that, the House passed bill?
So the president's framework has been very clear on his priorities in terms of tax reform.
Okay, I understand.
He has a very robust agenda.
I just want to be clear. You do not support the House-passed bill.
I just said that we have, there's not I'm not here to negotiate that particular piece of the legislation here today, but the president has put out
okay,
a very fulsome agenda around tax reform, focusing on taxing wealth and not work, and focused on taxing folks making more than $400,000 a year.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez is on. Is Menendez remote? Senator Tester is recognized.
Beautiful thing. I like that. Thank you very, very much. Just a couple things, and I don't want to get into an extended debate on this. I do want to get to the economy, and I want to thank you all for being here. But when Reserve Trust got their master account, they were not classified as a fintech. It was 3 years later they did that. And then there's an outfit by the name of Jack Henry that did the same thing. But what's more important here is to know that when a secretary, a very important secretary, came to my office during the Trump administration, and I asked him about disclosure and conflicts of interest, he looked at me and said, "That's none of you guys' business." A very important secretary. And he didn't answer any of the questions because he didn't think I needed to know any of the questions when I had him in my office. I could have tried to organize so we didn't have a vote on him, but the truth is I just voted no, and that was that. That's the first question. The second thing is that, Senator Toomey, I know you have great skills, and so does folks across the aisle, to be able to come in here and try to persuade minds. And I know it's difficult, because it's difficult from our side to change your guys' minds too. But part of showing up is having that debate. And part of showing up is having that debate before we have the vote. And God only knows what could have happened and didn't happen because nobody showed up. The last thing I would say is that I think you're giving Sarah Bloom Raskin way, way, way too much credit. I serve with a lot of folks here, and I'm sure when I get out of this position, they will continue to say, "Hey, John, would you consider this or consider that?" In whatever position I'm in, whether it's being a farmer in Montana or a meat cutter or whatever. And I would do the same thing that I think anybody on this committee would do, and that is, I'll take a look at it, I'll give you a fair shake, but I ain't just going to do what you tell me to do. And you guys are making the assumption that Sarah Bloom Raskin made a request and they just rolled. I'm going to tell you, if that's the case, we got the wrong people on these regional feds. We ought to take a look at replacing all of those, because if that's the process that's used for giving a master account, then we got bigger problems than Sarah Bloom Raskin. That's all. And I don't want to talk about any of that anymore. We just need to try to make this Senate functional, and not showing up does not add to the functionality of the United States Senate, which I think we can all agree is pretty damn dysfunctional at this moment in time. I want to talk about childcare because it's something I hear about almost all the time when I go back to Montana, and I'm going to talk about housing, which is what I almost always talk about when I go back to Montana. And the question I'm going to ask you is pretty simple, really, when it comes to childcare, and I don't care who answers it. I think we got a huge problem, and I think folks have figured it out. Because of the pandemic, when they were staying at home, they looked at their bottom line and said, "Hey, I got more money not paying childcare, not working, than busting my hump, working, and paying for childcare." So the question becomes, if we're going to have affordable childcare and accessible childcare, because that's important, I think, absolutely important in rural America, but probably important in urban America too. If we're going to have affordable childcare, how do we do that? How do we do that? Or do we just assume the private sector will take care of the problem? And if we do, how long will that take? Because my grandkids are actually in high school now, and when they were in childcare, it was over $10,000 a head for them to be in childcare 10 years ago. So does anybody want to respond to how we make childcare more affordable, more accessible, and what role the government should play in that?
I'm happy to take that question, Senator. This is such an important issue, and that is why addressing childcare was both an important part of the American Rescue Plan and also an important part of Build Back Better. So, I mean, here's the thing. It's, childcare businesses are, they're out there every day trying to provide a service to American families. It's a service that's incredibly expensive to provide, especially to get the kind of quality childcare workers that families need. And families can't afford those costs. And so the crux of what the president proposed in Build Back Better was to make it affordable for families to be able to pay for childcare by capping the amount of income that families have to pay, so that while at the same time subsidizing those businesses so that they could provide high quality care with qualified care providers to families all across the United States. And we're already seeing just how challenged that industry is right now. The number of workers in childcare has fallen over the course of the pandemic, as childcare centers have really struggled to make ends meet. We've seen now that the money from the American Rescue Plan is going out to those providers, out to over 150,000 providers nationwide to help them cover their costs during the pandemic. But all of this, it's about kids' well-being, and we know that quality childcare is important for our future economy, but it's also about making sure that parents can get to work. You know, we have questions about making sure that labor supply gets back to where it was pre-pandemic, and a lot of that is about addressing this childcare crisis in America.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I'd love to get to housing, and I'd love to get to some job training issues, but I'll turn it back to the chairman and ranking member. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Rounds is recognized from South Dakota, is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just begin by saying I appreciate the opportunity to participate this way, and I'd like to focus on inflation and the causes of it. And I'd like from our witnesses to talk a little bit about the differences between what may very well be demand side challenges versus supply side. My constituents in South Dakota, like Americans across the country, are being squeezed by higher prices across the board. Consumer prices in January were up 7.5% from a year ago. Energy prices overall were 27% higher in January than they were 1 year earlier. And electricity prices have jumped 10.7%. National gas prices have soared 40% since January of 2021, reaching the highest level since August of 2014. Right now, inflation, excuse me, and the CPI indications are of about 7.5% nationally, and PPI basically about 9.7%, which would suggest that there is going to be additional, or at least there is more inflation in our future rather than less. My question, Dr. Rouse, is what portion of this in your analysis, how much of this is due to demand side, where the Fed would basically have a role, versus the supply side, which, as you indicated in your testimony earlier, this is perhaps, both the president having some things to do and the Fed having some things to do. First of all, would you agree that the supply side basically would rest more on the presidential side and the demand side more on the Federal Reserve side?
Well, thank you for the question. So the way that I see it is that we have inflation because it was important for the federal government to support household workers, businesses through the pandemic. That is to maintain demand. We see this in countries around the world that could afford to do so, that they maintained, that they protected their constituents through the pandemic. Supply wasn't able to accommodate that demand, and inflation fundamentally comes when you have a mismatch between supply and demand. So, there have been various estimates that have been put out that what we say the confidence interval is very wide, but we know that as we get through the pandemic, we will see regulation in both of them. And so, what I would say is that as we're expecting that as we work through this pandemic, that the price pressures will ease. Outside forecasters are expecting inflation to be about half by this time next year.
If I could, I really didn't mean it to. It's not intended as a gotcha question. I'm just curious. When we talk about inflation, we know that it's both sides, and look, we recognize that we did what we could during the pandemic to be able to make sure that our economy could recover as quickly as possible. My question is just right now with inflation where it's at, how do we go about addressing it? If we're serious about addressing it, how do we do that if we can't determine how much the Federal Reserve should do versus how much the administration should do? And that's my question is if you don't have that information, or if that's not part of the studies, why not?
So the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and this is, they are studying, and they will determine the speed and the size of their response. I will note that on the fiscal side, that the fiscal impulse has already turned rather negative. So we are already not putting as much, fiscal resources into the economy, which will actually be slowing down the economy relative to where it has been over the last 2 years. And we expect that as people come back into the workforce, as the pandemic is under control, that will ease some constraints. Getting people back to work will help on the supply side. And as the pandemic is addressed around the world in particular, that will help bring more goods as well. So we expect, so there is a role to play for the Federal Reserve and in terms of fiscal policy in helping us to normalize through this pandemic. I might
Senator, let me just say a couple words, if I might, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My only concern on this is that I really think it's difficult to bring this under control if we don't recognize how much of this is actually due to supply side issues versus demand side. And I think part of that is the cost of petroleum, which is going to impact everybody. And I think when we're not talking about what's happening right now in terms of, we talk about shutting down oil and gas leases on federal land and so forth, that sends a message of futures costs on crude and so forth. That may very well work well for Mr. Putin, because right now he's getting record profits out of the oil and gas that he's producing, while at the same time back here at home, what we're seeing is increasing prices for our consumers. I just think that needs to be taken into account, and it may not be a popular thing to talk about right now with the administration. I think the American people should understand that a lot of the inflationary trends that we're seeing are due to the inflationary pushes on the supply side, which is restricting the ability of us to have fuel prices right now down where they were a year or a year and a half ago. And I am kind of surprised that the split between the supply side and the demand side has not been a little bit more of the discussion that we should be having if we really want to get it under control. But Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Dr. Bernstein, thank you, Senator Rounds. Dr. Bernstein, please answer briefly.
I'll try to be brief, because I actually like the way you teed the question up, and I think that our view reflects much of the way you frame this, in the sense that both demand and supply are clearly playing a role. The Federal Reserve, of course, works more through the demand channel, and as you suggested, our work is and can help further on the supply channel. The answer to the question of how much should each should do everything it can until inflationary pressures normalize. What that means on the side of the government, and Congress definitely has a very important role to help here, is to focus on the near, medium, and longer-term supply chain constraints. And the near term, as I've mentioned, we've intervened extensively in the ports through trucking. Our competition agenda is, as Chair Rouse suggested, intended to help ease consumer prices in those sectors. And then over the medium term, we very much believe that investing in domestic semiconductor capacity is so important, particularly regarding cars, a real source of auto pressure. We talked a little bit about housing. That has the largest weight in the consumer price index. And over the longer term, the infrastructure bill and the measures in Build Back Better are designed both to increase the economy's supply side productive capacity and help reduce costs that consumers face. So I think your framework is actually the correct one. And I think between the work of the Federal Reserve and government trying to expand productive capacity and supply side, we can ease those pressures, perhaps as the forecast suggests, by the end of this year.
Thank you. Senator Menendez is recognized from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't come here to talk about SALT, but since the ranking member raised it, let me just say, if I was Pennsylvania, I'd like the way things are. Pennsylvania gets $15 billion more from the federal treasury than it contributes to the federal treasury. So if we could do that, I'd be happy to make a deal with all my colleagues who have a problem with SALT, that we'll just get back whatever we send. And New Jersey would be very happy, because there are maker states like New Jersey that invest in education and research and development, in infrastructure, that helps it drive the economy and sends billions to the federal treasury, more than it gets in return. So it's a maker state. And then there are those states that I call moocher states, that get a lot more than it sends to the federal treasury. If you want to continue to have states that are maker states, that are blue chip states, that make money for the federal treasury, then just continue to ox the state and local property tax deduction, which is the longest serving part of the federal code in terms of a deduction, and you will see those states be less of maker states, so that you can continue to mooch off of it. But let me move to the more current issue of the time. There's no doubt that American families are feeling the pain of inflation as supply shortages have wreaked havoc on the world economy. However, that pain has been magnified by companies that are hiding behind the headline inflation figures to justify raising prices and profits on the backs of hardworking Americans. And let's be clear, corporations are not the ones hurting right now. Here's a transcript of Kimberly-Clark's last earnings call a few weeks ago. CEO Mike Hsu stated that the company took, quote, decisive action to offset the impact of higher costs with significant pricing actions. He wasn't kidding. The price of a 50-pack of Kimberly Clark N95 mask more than doubled from $23.19 to $57.15 from last October to January. And the company's plan for the future is not to deliver relief to consumers, but to resume stock buybacks, quote, as soon as we get the excess cash flow. It's amazing to seek profit beyond simply hiding behind the issue of inflation. Dr. Bernstein, are you seeing this occur in other sectors of the economy as well?
Yeah, profit rates and profit margins are highly elevated for firms across many sectors of the economy. That's a short answer to your question. I guess putting that in the context of our discussion, and by the way, I did want to correct something that Senator Toomey said. Actually, while you're correct about the year-over-year numbers, last month, real wages actually beat inflation. But I wanted to talk about this in the context of wage growth and inflation. It is commonly argued that wage growth is a source of inflation. And that is potentially true based on a full set of other factors that contribute to inflation, including productivity growth and the share of national income that's going to labor or to profits. And it is completely coherent within the algebra of how wages and inflation interact that non-inflationary wage growth can be paid for out of reduced profit margins. And I think that's relevant to.
Well, I just cited one quarterly profit call. There are many others in which clearly the companies are using the guise of inflation to ratchet up their earnings. And that is unconscionable. And we have to think about ways in which that transparency can take place so that consumers know. It's just pretty astounding. Let me ask one other question. We're facing a dire, even as we talk about a growing economy, we have a labor shortage across the economy, which is contributing also, in my mind, to rising inflation and unmet consumer demand. There are currently nearly 11 million job openings nationwide across low-wage and high-school industries. Immigrants are ready and willing to fill those jobs. We had the Secretary of Energy in New Jersey the other day at one of our research and development centers. The four of the 6 people who made presentations were clearly immigrants to the United States, leading the way in innovation. Unfortunately, there's over 1.6 million immigrants still have pending work permit applications before USCIS, and over 8 million immigrants that are stuck in the broader visa backlog. Leading business groups, including the American Business Immigration Coalition, agree that robust immigration legalization provisions are urgently needed to address our significant labor shortage. What would each of you say is the role of immigrant workers in mitigating the current labor shortage and rising inflation?
Well, thank you, Senator Menendez from the great state of New Jersey. We completely agree, and the president, from day one of his administration, he sent a bill to Congress to modernize the immigration system. He has also issued an executive order directing a top-down review of barriers to access in our legal immigration system, as you know, on which U.S.-based employers rely to fill these critical labor needs. So in response to that order, agencies have worked to create efficiencies in the work permit process, expediting work permit approvals for health professionals, extended the period for which such permits are valid, and are actively considering other administrative actions to expand the labor supply. So immigration is part of the solution here. I will add that part of our labor supply challenge was going to happen just due to the natural demographics of our society. This pandemic hit at the height of pretty much at the height of the baby boom as they were retiring, and we have seen some excess retirements. I will add that a key part of getting people back to work will be addressing the pandemic and ensuring we have the tools so that people can get back to work safely and not risk their health. But there's no question that facilitating dealing with the backlog of these visas is top of mind. The president's team is working on it, and that is part of the solution as well.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized from his office.
Chairman Brown, thank you. And I just want to start off by echoing Ranking Member Toomey's comments earlier about the markup that occurred. That was supposed to occur earlier this week. It is truly a shame, in my opinion, that we didn't move forward and get 5 of the 6 nominees approved. I wrote a letter in August supporting Chairman Powell's renomination. And I know, given past concern from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the use of the revolving door, frankly, I'm a bit surprised that they would not share a desire to fully vet this nominee before moving forward. Turning to my statement, 2020 was a year of rampant inflation, growing from 1.4% at the start of President Biden's term now to over 7.5%. Inflation grew faster and is continuing to grow faster than wages for the vast majority of workers, meaning that paychecks are effectively shrinking every month as this continues. On an annualized basis, real average hourly earnings dropped 1.7%. And of course, other parts of the economy are feeling the pain. Homebuilder confidence. I grew up the son of a homebuilder. Their confidence fell for the second straight month, in large part due to spiking lumber and steel prices, as well as months-long waits for cabinets, garage doors, countertops, and just about everything else you would find in a standard home. Energy prices are rising. Gas up 40% year over year, fuel oil up 46% year over year, and up 9.5% in just the last month. And I just found it frankly startling. We're seeing significant increases of Russian diesel being imported now at a time when we're watching the Russians invade Ukraine. This, of course, not going unnoticed by Montanans and Americans across the country. Consumer sentiment is lower now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, according to a recent Gallup poll, 71% of individuals living in households with incomes of $40,000 or less say that price hikes have caused their family financial hardship. 71%. Of course, we were all told all throughout 2021 by President Biden's administration that this inflation was transitory. I've not heard the word transitory lately, and it will come down. And many of us on this side of the aisle were questioning this belief this would be transitory. We didn't buy it. And sadly, our predictions now have come true. They're continuing to insist that a peak is just around the corner. Well, even if it is, I've not seen anything that suggests that 7.5% is far too high. We just don't need inflation to peak soon. We need it to plummet. Now to a few questions. Looking back at the economy in February of 2020, we saw what I would describe as a Goldilocks economy. We had wage growth across the board. Inflation was in check. Wages were actually growing the fastest for individuals at the bottom of the wage spectrum. To me, based non-inflationary growth was about as good as it gets. My question for the panel is this: would you agree that the pre-pandemic economy from February of 20 is better than the economic picture as we see it here today? A simple yes or no will suffice.
I will agree that the pre-pandemic economy on net was looking fairly strong. However, that pre-pandemic economy reflected many years of rather anemic growth. It was reflecting, even in terms of wage growth at the median, we had seen a little bit, but there had been decades where at the median there hadn't been robust wage growth. We know that there were gaps by race and ethnicity that had been longstanding. So I would argue that while in February of 2020, the bones of the economy were strong, that there were weaknesses there that this president felt we should address, which is why his economic agenda is designed to increase the economic capacity in order to generate more robust, sustainable growth that can be more equitably shared.
I'll weigh in on your question as well. The labor market is actually tighter now than it was then by some metrics. The unemployment rate was lower then than it is now, though not by much, 3.5 versus 4%. There are far more job openings now than there were then. The GDP, probably the most commonly cited indicator of economic health and growth, is considerably faster now than it was then, growing, which is consistent with what you heard.
You're suggesting we're better off right now than we were in February of 20?
I'm saying that there are it's not a simple yes/no question, is what I'm more than suggesting. It's what I'm articulating here. There are a set of economic indicators: job openings, GDP growth, child poverty. Child poverty is actually lower when you factor in the interventions in the rescue plan in 2021, probably, than it was in 2020. We only have estimates of that so far. And that's very much a function of the president's rescue plan. By pulling the recovery forward, by getting shots in arms and checks in pockets.
Dr. Bernstein, I just firmly disagree with that. We had $1 trillion of unspent COVID dollars at the end of 2020. And then on a purely partisan basis, our colleagues pushed another $2 trillion of federal spending into the economy in Q1.
Well, Senator, excuse me, Senator, I understand your point.
Anyway, I just respectfully disagree.
Okay, well, I understand your point, but let me just answer the question.
Senator, Dr. Bernstein, hold on.
Let me just
wait, Dr. Bernstein.
I want to answer the question that you.
Dr. Bernstein, wait a minute. Senator Daines, is that your last question? And then I'll give him a chance to answer.
I think I'm out of time, Chairman Brown. I want to respect the committee.
Okay, Dr. Bernstein, a very short answer.
Very short answer.
30 seconds.
I'm simply trying to answer the question that you posed, Senator, and ticking off a set of indicators that are actually doing better now than they were then in the context of a 100-year pandemic, which I think is a remarkable achievement for our administration and those in Congress who helped us.
Thank you, Dr. Bernstein.
Let's keep in mind the federal balance sheet right now is trillions of dollars higher than it was before. Anyway, thank you.
Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this committee's non-transitory transitory but relentless focus on this issue. And I would point out to my colleague, I spent a lot of time working with the former president's Treasury Secretary, Secretary Mnuchin, where we put about $5 trillion, $4.5 to $5 trillion under President Trump into COVID relief. We're talking about what's potentially driving inflation. I think those investments, I was proud to work with him on those investments, and I think they frankly saved this country from not only a recession, but potentially depression. I want to come to a topic that a couple members have mentioned, but I don't think have drilled down in, and that's our housing shortage. We've seen rents go up 13.5% nationwide over the last year. Some markets it's gone up 20%. We've seen home prices double over the last decade. A lot of this is frankly due to housing shortages. We now have a housing shortage of about 1.7 million units, and that grows by about 150,000 units each year. And everything I've heard, at least, is that shortage is particularly acute, not at the upper ends, not even on the rental side at the highest end rental, or it really is the most acute at low income housing. And that's one of the reasons why, working with the chairman and many of us on the committee, we had a robust housing package in the president's second part of his initiative that would have gone towards this supply issue. Because if you're looking at housing costs driving upwards of a third of CPI, and housing is a huge component of low and moderate income folks' basic nut they've got to meet each month. If we really want to take on systemically, and not in a transitory basis, but in a relentless basis, the question of inflation, we got to increase housing supplies. So, Dr. Bernstein, and I'd then be happy to hear from other members of the panel as well. What should we be doing on housing supply? And I was going to ask two questions. I'll try to ask just one, recognizing I'd like to get from the whole panel. Housing supply, won't that address inflation? Won't happen overnight, but we've got this is a long-term problem that's been developing over a decade. And beyond just direct government programs, there are tax initiatives like LIHEAP and others that, LIHTC and others that I think make some sense. Private sector, been bipartisan, Florida LIHTC gives that kind of incentive for low housing construction to developers. Shouldn't we use these in our toolbox if we're really going to take on, not in a short term, but in a long-term basis, inflation?
Yes, that is an extremely important set of questions, and let me begin by thanking you for your leadership on this work, and as well as others on the committee. Let me start by just saying why this is so important, underscoring some of the points that you made, Senator. There is a long-term supply shortfall in the housing sector, and you mentioned 150,000 units each year deficient supply. Multiply that by 10, and you get to your the number that you're suggesting in terms of a shortfall. This is a market failure that's particularly acute in the bottom half of the market. And why? It's because the math doesn't always add up for people to build, for builders to build, along with the problem of exclusionary zoning problems. This makes this key to the president's equity agenda, especially in rural areas and communities of color. And the third issue you correctly raised was inflation. Shelter is the largest single component in the CPI. Housing experts Jim Parrott and Mark Zandi recently wrote, quote, "If policymakers are serious about reining in inflation, then they have little choice but to take on the shortfall in housing supply." What can we do? The administration is already actively using its executive powers to increase housing supply and access. We've coordinated with various agencies, Fannie, Freddie, HUD, Treasury, to create, deliver, or preserve 100,000 affordable units over the next 3 years. But the administration toolbox, Senator, as you well know, is not nearly big enough to deal with the supply shortage that goes back a decade at least. Investments that we make now will pay off for many years to come. Ideas that we've put on the table, many of which you've helped champion, have a long history of bipartisan support, and they involve the tax credits that help to incentivize building on the supply side, where too often middle and low-income housing doesn't pencil out given land, permitting, materials, and costs, again, which predated the pandemic, resources to help build and renovate houses, and resources to build housing infrastructure through Community Development Block Grant, which includes action on exclusionary zoning. I can say more about any of those details. It would probably take a whole nother hearing to go through them in the way they deserve, but let me stop there for now.
And I think we've run out of time, so I would welcome any of my Republican colleagues who want to work with me on bipartisan tax policy that actually incents the increase of supply. If we don't want to take a transitory approach and we want to take a long-term approach to deal with inflation, we've got to increase the supply of housing, particularly for low and moderate income people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for showing up this morning. It's been a fairly feisty hearing, it sounds like to me, over watching this back in the office and paying attention to the comments. And I will say, there must be millions of kitchen table economists, also known as parents, all over the country asking what in the world is the value of an economist degree in Washington, D.C. Because if we are failing to answer the simple question that Senator Daines asked, which is, are we better off today than we were a year ago? The answer is emphatically no. That's not a question that people at the kitchen table are asking in a serious manner. When you ask yourself if the average person in this country, whether inflation was better this month than wages, the cumulative effect of inflation in an average household in the country, when your gas prices are up 40% and your utilities are up 20%, the answer is no. If you have had a 4% increase in your wages and a 7% increase in inflation, the bottom line is that your spending power is down, not up. If in fact you can look at inflation as an additional tax on those folks with fixed incomes, are they better off? The answer is no. This is not a hard question to even dig into. This is a simple question that is clear. When your food is higher and your clothing is higher and your utilities are higher and your gas is higher, to suggest that we are anything other than worse off this year than we were last year, you don't even have to believe me. Ask the president's approval ratings, the lowest ever. Why? It's because the average American family is suffering through an incredible crisis that they don't have to hear what you are saying. They can see with their own eyes the disappearing dollars in their accounts. This is not hard to see. This is easy to see. What we should be asking ourselves is, how do we make it better? Not pretending as if it's not bad. It's really bad and getting worse. When you are at a 40-year high in inflation, This is not something that the average person says, I don't really understand what inflation is anymore. They don't even ask the question, what is the definition of transitory? Because this is not transitory. So the question I'd pose, if I had a question for all three of you, is how do we tell the American people that the inflationary impact is not devastating to someone like the woman who raised me, a single mother, who's looking at her account go down and her challenges go up? How do we say to that person that there is somehow, some way, good news in the current economy? And frankly, the confusion that's going to be caused at tax time when we accelerated the tax refunds through the $300 a monthly payment, that leads to confusion and a delay in refunds because we thought there was a better way to deal with the child tax credit. I think that's going to add more confusion to this economy, less confidence in this economy going forward. So I hear what you're saying, and I think the average American is literally sitting there asking themselves, this cannot be the banking committee in the United States Senate unable to come to the conclusion that we came to in January 21, February of 21, March of 21, January of 22, February of 22, and we're going to be saying the same thing in March of 22 as well. So I'd love to hear how inflation is not having the negative impact that every other person in the country seems to be fully going through right now.
Well, Senator Scott, look, we understand, the president understands your kitchen table economics and your, what people are concerned around the table. Part of the challenge is we are in we hope, only 100-year pandemic. We've been living with this for 2 years. In this country, we've had 900,000 deaths. The cases, we are still living with this pandemic. What is hard for all of us to understand and appreciate is what would have happened without the American Rescue Plan, without the other efforts of the federal government and the Federal Reserve to rescue this economy and ensure that we got through whole. I appreciate that is a very hard counterfactual to contemplate. I am not saying that we are exactly where we want to be, but as we have highlighted, we have had the strongest recovery, on record. We are doing better than our peers. Unemployment has fallen dramatically. I would remind the kitchen table, as the kitchen table economists, that when the president took office, the economy was almost 9.5 million jobs short of where it was when the pandemic started. And we've recovered almost all of those jobs. So now we have people who want a job can get a job. That unemployment has fallen more quickly than it ever has in a recovery. And so while we have challenges, there is no doubt. And the president is focused on doing what he can in the short term to try to ease supply challenges, to nominate the Federal Reserve nominees. And Senator Toomey, I won't say anything more about that. But we know that we need to get inflation under control. There is no question about it. I think that the number one way that the president needs to be focused on, and we all need to be focused on, is getting this pandemic under control.
Thank you,
because this is all driven by the pandemic.
Mostly because Chairman Brown's going to cut me off in a second, so I just want to finish up here because I think it's really important. I think you make some really good points. Proving a counterfactual is important. I, like many of my colleagues, would love to have been able to vote for 4 members of the Federal Reserve and get answers on the 5th one. I do think that unemployment has fallen without any question, partially because the long-term unemployed should be absorbed in those numbers as well. As we all know, especially you all better than I, that when the more people who are in the long-term unemployment line, the lower your unemployment rate goes. And I'll finally finish with this because you've been very gracious, Chairman, with my time, and I appreciate that more than I can say, that the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that had about 10% for COVID-related health, 1% for vaccines, and $1.6 or $7 trillion for spending that actually helped to fuel the inflationary impact that we are now trying to recover from has also been problematic. Thank
Thank
you,
you, Senator
Chairman.
Scott. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do hope we'll vote on the Federal Reserve nominees. Vote yes, vote no, but let's vote on all of them. We passed the American Rescue Plan just about a year ago because the pandemic had hit our economy hard. It had hit workers hard. Millions of Americans were out of work. And as you've testified today, and as the facts show, and I think those facts are uncontested, we've seen jobs come roaring back. Over 6.6 million jobs, a record in the United States. We've seen very robust real GDP growth of 5.7% in 2021. Now, one of the reasons we passed the American Rescue Plan was because families' incomes were being squeezed when they were out of work. That included the $1,400 individual payments. Did it not, Dr. Rouse?
Yes, it did.
And I keep hearing from our colleagues about how the real purchasing power of American families went down in 2021. It did not. Isn't it the case that real disposable income grew in 2021?
Well, so again, I will just refer to our chart here, which is some new evidence from economists at UC Berkeley, and which suggests, especially for the bottom 50%, that if you look at their market wages before tax and before benefits, that they're better off today than in the last quarter of 2019. And then when you add in benefits and after taxes, they are ahead. So we know that inflation is a challenge, but household balance sheets have
well, so
weathered
look, if I'm a household, and what I look at is what is my purchasing power this year over last year. And isn't it a fact that real purchasing power went up in 2021?
It did. So these data suggest it did for most families. But we have to acknowledge that inflation has also been a challenge and has eaten into some of that purchasing power. But because due to the record GDP growth, there has been a very strong recovery so that household balance sheets are strong and many Americans are better off today than they were at the beginning of the year.
All right. And so, as I look at that, when you factor in the individual payments from the American Rescue Plan, when you factor in the other relief, taken together with people's wages, the data indicate that we've seen a growth in disposable after-tax income, and especially so for lower wage individuals. Let's get to where we are now, because there's been a lot of year-over-year comparison with respect to real wages. And I think, Dr. Bernstein, I think I heard you clarifying something that had been said earlier. But if you look at January's figures with respect to real wages, what do we see?
I will tell you what we see, but I'll also give you the beloved CEA caveat, which is that we never read too much into any one month. We're always looking for trends. However, we also look closely at the jobs report, and it did show in January that the hourly wage beat the pace of inflation. I think the hourly wage was up, if I'm remembering correctly, 0.7%. Inflation was up 0.6%. Now, that's 1 month. But it is indicative of trends that you've heard about from all of us here today. The strength of the job market, that was a month where we had an upside surprise in job gains of 467,000 jobs, well above what was expected, and a job market that was powering through Omicron that was very much upon the land that month. We should also underscore what Chair Rouse was just talking about, that when the job market tightens up as much as it has, bargaining power, leverage among working people goes up disproportionately for those in the bottom half. And that's one of the factors that's behind the stronger wage growth in the bottom half and what you see there vis-a-vis market incomes and disposable incomes.
All right, joining me here on Live Now from Fox is Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee. Senator, good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
The situation with Ukraine and Russia is still very tense. Today was supposed to be some type of unity day in Ukraine. The 16th was, according to intelligence assessments, the day Russia may invade. Is the Senate readying a sanctions package? Your House colleagues have introduced the Never Yielding Europe's Territory Act. What is going on with sanctions in the Senate?
Yes, Senator Risch has been the lead on our NET Act, and it is sanctions. Of course, people like me tried to get the White House to move forward last fall, and I had a letter sent over to the White House saying, now is the time for sanctions. Now is the time to stop Nord Stream 2. Now is the time to begin lethal aid sales to Ukraine so they can defend themselves. And now is the time for a coordinated diplomatic message that sends a very clear message to Russia, what we will do to our allies so they know we're going to be there with them, whether it's Ukraine or the NATO countries that are in the region. Of course, the White House didn't do that. So Republicans have a proactive approach on this because the White House is saying, well, we're not going to do anything unless they go in. Right. And then we'll take an action. They're totally retroactive on this.
But don't you think sanctions should maybe be imposed preemptively as a deterrent before any such action happens? Is that on the table?
Well, that is something Republicans have put on the table. Like I said, last fall, that's what I said. Let's get sanctions in place on Putin, on the oligarchs, and on the country. Because when you do that, you freeze their assets and you slow their economy and you make it more difficult for them to take an adverse action.
Okay, we know President Biden spoke yesterday on the administration's strategy up until this point. No new policy changes. Strong words, though, from the president on, ensuring the NATO alliance, ensuring the post-World War II order in Europe. They have moved embassy personnel out of Kiev, up more north in Lviv. Did you support that move? Do you think that was too little or too late? And how would you grade President Biden's handling of this right now?
When you look at President Biden's handling, I think about Robert Gates and his comment that Joe Biden had been wrong on every foreign policy issue for 40 years. And you see that he passed that window of opportunity that would have been that proactive approach. And we wouldn't find ourselves in this situation. And back in the fall, there were 75,000 troops that were up on the Russia-Ukraine border. Today, there's 130,000 plus all of the artillery that is there, the different encampments that have been put on that border. There are also naval assets in the Black Sea off the port, and they're around Odessa. So we would not find ourselves in this position. It's important to realize, too, that Putin has had a tendency when the world is focused on big events to make a move. He did it in 2008 after the Beijing Games when he went into Georgia. He did it again in 2014 when he went into Crimea. This is why we're watching as the Olympics draw to a close, and it is expected that if he is going to make a move, this is when he would make it.
Do you give the administration, do they deserve some credit? Because they seem to see, the intelligence officials at least, Secretary of State Blinken and the State Department, they are publicly kind of telegraphing what Russia intelligence is doing and making that known to reporters, maybe as a way to, preempt some type of action. Do you give them at least some leeway there?
I think that it is appropriate that they finally came to the table and realized they have to take Putin seriously because Putin views Joe Biden as weak, as rudderless, He remembers that when it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden in the White House, they sent the Ukrainian army blankets and meals ready to eat. Donald Trump, when he was in the White House, sent the Ukrainian army bombs and bullets. And Putin understands this. So we think that it is appropriate that finally this White House is taking this as the serious issue that it is.
And diplomacy still continues. Thankfully, no invasion as of yet. We'll continue to monitor this. I want to move on to another topic. Earlier last week, you had threatened to withhold the continuing resolution, to hold that up if you did not get clarity on this grant proposal from Health and Human Services that would fund drug addicts in recovery. And there was a lot of back and forth about our taxpayers going to essentially be funding crack pipes at safe injection sites. You got an answer on that, but you were willing to hold up government funding, maybe get a government shutdown to get an answer on that. Are your concerns alleviated?
One of the things that was so interesting to us is how this all did come to light. And people were saying, you got to be kidding me. We have such drug issues. We have the cartels pushing pounds of drugs into this country, fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, meth. And now we're finding out that SAMHSA, through their grant process, has been putting these harm reduction grant dollars into these safe smoking kits. The safe smoking kits generally carry needles and pipes and tubes and things of that nature. What we got was a commitment that going forward, no taxpayer dollars are going to be used for any of these safe smoking kits. Now, there is still a difference of opinion between HHS and the Drug Policy Alliance about what those dollars have been used for in the past. But these are taxpayer dollars. They are not to be used ever in any way for drug paraphernalia.
And the Health and Human Services Secretary Becerra, he said that, this was never on the table. He says no federal funding will be used directly or throughout subsequent reimbursement of grantees to put pipes in safe smoking kits. But your colleagues, Senator Manchin, Senator Rubio, they just introduced what is known as the PIPES Act to make sure this is codified into some sort of legislation that no taxpayer money would ever go to something like that. Do you agree with that?
That's exactly right. Yes. What they did, based on what we found out from HHS, and as I said, we didn't get clarity on what has happened in the past. We get clarity on going forward. So Senators Manchin and Rubio are going to put this into legislative language. As we take up the CR, this is one of the amendments that we will vote on, so that you make sure that just as you cannot use the money for needles, you cannot use it for pipes or the components of pipes.
Senator, two more questions for you. The CDC is apparently going to update their indoor mask guidance and some other COVID-19 guidance, possibly next week, according to reports. Do you think the CDC is behind the ball game here? We've seen other states, mayors, especially of blue cities and blue states, already plan to do away with their indoor mask mandates. Is the CDC just catching up at this point?
Yes, the CDC is just catching up. In states like my state of Tennessee, people have been without these masks. Many of the school systems, children are not wearing masks as they are in their academic day. They're not wearing them for extracurricular activities. What we know is that we are moving from the pandemic stage to an endemic stage. We have to learn to live with COVID. We're probably going to have a different strain of COVID every year or so, just like we do with the flu. So it is important that we learn how to keep ourselves safe and live with this and get our lives back to normal.
And just lastly, Senator, the president said that before the end of the month, he wants to announce his SCOTUS nomination to replace retiring Justice Breyer. He said that it's going to be an African-American woman. Are you open to meeting with that nominee to potentially, if she has the legal credentials, the legal pedigree, and the qualifications, would you support that nominee?
We look forward to meeting with the nominee and beginning the vetting process. As soon as the nominee is announced, those of us at Senate Judiciary Committee will begin to individually look at opinions, writings, rulings, speeches, and then develop a series of questions. I will look forward to meeting individually with the nominee and then going through the period of questioning at committee that we will have with the nominee. Following that, after there is discussion at committee, whomever is the nominee will then move forward to a consideration by the full Senate. Individuals in the Senate will all want to meet individually with this nominee. Bear in mind, this is a lifetime appointment. So there is a lot of work that goes into a Supreme Court justice. And we look forward to conducting that due diligence and coming to a decision.
So what you're saying, you're undecided either way, yay or nay. You want to?
We don't know who the nominee is.
Okay.
So, and every nominee is different. There are some that you decide to support, and there are some that you decide you cannot support.
All right, Senator Marsha Blackburn, as always, we appreciate your time here on Live Now. We'll talk to you again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Doug Burns. Doug, thanks for being with us. It's been a busy day. Let's get right into the first one, and we have been talking about this for some time this week, having to do with former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin. We know that the unanimous jury ruled in favor of the New York Times in that defamation suit, but now a legal filing, I believe just yesterday, essentially says that the jury got push alerts telling them what the judge did by dismissing the case before the jury deliberations were even over. Now, you've been in this business industry for a very long time. What do you make of that?
Well, again, we start with the proposition that it was really unusual that the judge indicated that he was going to dismiss the case, before the jury finished the deliberations. I looked a little closer. He was saying that the rationale was to allow an appellate court, to not have to cause a retrial if there was, an overturned decision, because you already had the jury verdict. You don't need to try the case again. But again, he could have waited until they were done and then simply thrown it out, or he could have thrown it out before they started and sent them home. One of my friends made a great point, so I'll share it with everybody. He said that, this could have happened 40 years ago. The analogy was a juror not reading newspapers would walk by a newsstand and see a headline. You see what I mean? They didn't do anything intentional. So this is sort of the digitized version of that. So again, I think it was a couple of jurors. They told the judge that it did not affect their approach to the deliberations. So there's a couple of options. I mean, the judge could simply take that and just move on and not grant any type of relief, or he could call them in, have a hearing with the lawyers and say, please tell us exactly how you came into this information. Did it affect your deliberations? They'll repeat no. The last thing would be the law school classroom hypothetical. If they came in and said, yes, it did affect me, I was on the fence, and when I saw that you were throwing it out, Your Honor, that pushed me towards, and again, this is just a wild hypothetical, that pushed me towards my verdict in favor of the defendant, the New York Times, then the judge probably would declare a mistrial. In that classroom hypothetical only, my prediction real quick is that the judge will deny the relief and the case will go forward as it is.
But speaking to that question of if it was prejudicial, the jurors seemingly said that it wasn't. Much to your point, we did get some reporting that they said, did not impact their decision either way. So this is still going to have legs, though, in the next few weeks and months. Isn't that right?
Well, of course, they're going to raise on appeal one way or the other. They're going to say that, this highly unusual move by the judge did have some possible prejudicial effect. And in point of fact, two of the jurors, I don't know, it's like verbatim from their appeal brief, two of the jurors indicated that they had seen news flashes on their phone. So it creates an appellate issue. And, we'll see what happens. But it's not, it could have been more serious, like they watched an extensive program. They watched you and I, talking about it for 20 minutes in detail. This was just like a quick flash on their phone, apparently.
All right, Doug, I do want to move on to a pretty major ruling there in New York today. We learned that a court ruled in favor of New York Attorney General Tish James that Donald Trump must appear before her office, including his children, I believe Don Jr. and Ivanka, as part of their investigation into his financial dealings. And we have been really kind of watching this. We know the subpoenas were issued. We know the Trumps had said they were not going to, abide by those subpoenas. But now they have to. What does this mean for a former president?
Well, it's very interesting because, people can say through their lawyers, I'm not going to agree to go to that deposition. And then you get a court order. So this thing ended up in court. The president and his two children, Don Jr. and Ivanka, they moved to quash the subpoena. That's the term, to invalidate it. And the judge held a 2-hour hearing today. The Trump arguments included, this is politically based, it's a witch hunt. But they had one legal argument that has some interesting nuances to it. So let me explain that quickly. And that is that this is a civil investigation. Okay, but there's also a criminal investigation apparently underway. So in a criminal case, if you assert your Fifth Amendment right, it can't be used against you because you have an absolute constitutional right to remain silent. And the judge tells the jury that there's no inference to be drawn by that. But in a civil case, there can be a negative inference against an individual for taking the Fifth. This is the juxtaposition of law and public relations, because the judge said, as they were complaining about being forced to testify, the judge volleyed back with, what are you talking about? You can assert your Fifth Amendment privilege. But again, that creates a couple of problems. Number one, they could use that against them in the civil case. And number two, there's sort of shadow boxing for the criminal case that's behind it. So the president of the United States, trust me, on this point, as you well know, but I'll tell everybody, he's not going to assert the Fifth Amendment because you'll have headlines that'll be at the level of World War III breaking out. So the point is, you can't take the Fifth. It puts him in a little bit of a box. So I think he'll end up probably doing the deposition, if I had to guess.
Doug, I just wanted to go into some of the accusations and complaints filed by the New York Attorney General's office and what they're alleging the Trump organization did, essentially inflating some of their assets, including real estate, and also kind of deflating some of their assets as well to, get some type of tax relief. Do I have that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, basically, a very, very, very common white-collar offense, and I'm not saying anybody did it, but this is what they're investigating. Extremely common offense is to turn around and say that, the co-op that I live in is worth, a few $100,000 more than it is to get a loan, okay? And the point is, overvaluing an asset as collateral, okay? This painting behind me, is worth double what it's really worth to get a loan. So that's the allegation. So they're investigating that civilly. And the judge said today, he said, look, the Attorney General is saying that they have opened up some substantial investigative lines along the lines of overstating assets to get loans, and they're entitled to take the deposition of the three of them. And so that's the way the judge ruled. And as I said earlier, he said they can take the Fifth Amendment if they feel it's warranted, but I think that's wildly unrealistic, as I said earlier. They're going to appeal. I figured maybe you would ask me that, and, we'll see what happens, whether an appellate court might take a different view. It's hard to say.
And Doug, just lastly on this, this was, in the words of Trump's lawyers, kind of tainted by politics because of that statement. New York Attorney General Tish James had said, I believe, while Trump was still in office, that she wants and her office want to go after him, after his family, after the Trump organization, and they tried to make that argument in court today. It didn't really hold up, though.
Well, I'm glad you raised that really quick, because the point is there are obviously political overtones to the case. But when you're in a court of law, not to be corny, the point is you crunch legal principles. So the fact of the matter is they stood up, the Attorney General's office, and said, this is what we're investigating, and we want to take a deposition of the individual who's involved. And that's just straight, dry legal stuff. The political discussion is sort of a side seminar, but there are some pretty substantial political overtones to it. I agree.
All right, Doug, just last story we want to get to. We're following as well the sentencing that's going to happen tomorrow of former Brooklyn Center, Minnesota police officer Kim Potter in the shooting death of Dante Wright back in spring of 2021. I wanted to get your thoughts. I do have kind of the minimum and maximum that she is facing. Apparently, for first-degree manslaughter, 86 months or 7 years, and second-degree manslaughter, 48 months or 4 years. Now, there's this effort to reduce her sentence based on either, good behavior. She's never been charged or convicted of a crime before. Do you think this will ultimately be reduced tomorrow?
Basically, you have what we call an advisory sentencing guidelines range, and you touched on it, and it's 7 to 8.5 years. But that's advisory, it's not mandatory. In federal courts, we had mandatory guidelines, which were then changed to advisory. So the point is, that's the advisory range. Interestingly enough, the prosecutors came in originally and they wanted an increase, an upward departure, that's called, on the grounds that she abused her position of authority and created an unreasonably dangerous environment. But then the prosecutors reversed course this week and said, no, the advisory range is fine. So starting with the proposition that you have an advisory sentencing guidelines range of 7 to 8.5. Now, the judge can go upward from that or downward from that, but has to state compelling reasons and lay them out for everybody. So my handicapping of it is that the defense is asking for probation, which is a little bit too much, in my opinion, to ask for. The prosecutors are asking for the 7 to 8.5. So we're going to go with the Solomonic approach, King Solomon, right? We're going to take the 8 and cut it in half, and my crystal ball prediction is 4 years.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because we had spoken with one of our reporters who's covering this from down on the ground there in Minneapolis, and he essentially was saying there is a possibility, you might be saying a very slim possibility, that she could just get time served in probation and serve the rest of her sentence maybe at home.
Well, unfortunately, and it's kind of a delicate topic, obviously, cases like this that get into, the media coverage and other aspects of it end up putting pressure on judges and courts, which, on some level is unfortunate. That's a separate discussion. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that the judge is going to be, influenced necessarily, but I think you get my point. Criminal law and high publicity sometimes are not a good mix. So again, I'm just bringing to the table my analysis of what I think the case merits, and I think a sentence of 3 to 5 years. So that's why I said 4 years would be an appropriate sentence. I don't think she's going to get time served on probation, and I also don't think she's going to get 8 years.
All right, Doug Burns, we appreciate you coming on and breaking down all those stories with us. They're important to cover, and we appreciate it. We'll probably bring you back just tomorrow for the sentencing of Kim Potter if you have some time. Doug, we thank you.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, we just want to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll be getting to some more of these top headlines. A lot of political headlines left to get to, a lot of COVID-19 headlines left to get to, so stay with us.
Well, hello, Stanford. I want to say can you give Sarah a round of applause for that wonderful introduction? Thank you, Sarah. Sarah and I have gotten to know each other a little bit this evening, and she knows the introduction I prefer is just a little bit shorter. Yeah. I love Stanford. Now, the introduction I prefer is just a little bit shorter. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. And it's my honor to be with all of you tonight here at Stanford. It really is. I want to thank you all for coming out to the Ken and Janice Shengold Advancing Freedom Lecture Series. I just spoke to Janice yesterday. She is a remarkable patriot, and we're grateful for her sponsorship of this. I'm also grateful for Young America's Foundation, that I've been traveling around the country to campuses speaking to young people just like all of you. Young America's Foundation for 50 years has been taking the cause of freedom and conservative values to campuses around the country. But most especially tonight, I want to thank the Stanford College Republicans. Members are with us tonight, and I understand it took a little bit of doing to get me on the campus, but I got to tell you, the stand that you took for freedom of speech on the campus of Stanford inspired people around the country. So let's hear it again for the Stanford College Republicans. We're proud of you. You know, Benjamin Franklin famously said that our founding fathers created, in his words, a republic, if you can keep it. And conservatives know that we can keep our republic. And with your help and your passion, we will keep the torch of life and liberty burning bright for this generation and every generation that'll follow. Before I go, let me share with you a little bit of my story. You know, I started out in politics as a Democrat. I was the Youth Democrat Party coordinator in Bartholomew County, Indiana, in 1976. Kind of a community organizer, if the truth be told. But over my high school years, I began to study the Constitution of the United States. I went to a small college. I studied the American founding. It was also a time that I made a personal decision to put my faith in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I must tell you that that was a time in my life when my politics and my thinking about America began to shift. And much of that thinking was impacted by the voice and the values and the optimism of the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. You know, when I heard Reagan's vision for this country, for a strong national defense, for limited government, for traditional values, it echoed out of everything that I'd ever heard from my father, who was a combat veteran, from my grandfather, who immigrated to this country from Ireland. I signed up for the Reagan Revolution and have never looked back. You know, my career would take me into talk radio. I actually hosted a talk radio show on 20 radio stations around the state of Indiana for about 7 years. I was kind of Rush Limbaugh on decaf. It's true. Eventually, I had the opportunity, as Sarah told you, to represent my hometown in the Congress of the United States. And then I had the privilege of serving as governor of the great state of Indiana. And you can imagine how deeply humbling it was for me the day I raised my right hand to serve as the 48th Vice President of the United States. And I want to thank you all for the privilege of serving as your Vice President. It was the greatest honor of my life. But on a very personal level, the highest title I will ever hold is spelled DAD. I'm the proud father of 3 people in your generation. My son is a captain in the United States Marine Corps. My daughter is a writer for the Daily Wire and a published author. And our youngest daughter, Audrey, graduated from Yale Law School and is practicing law. Now, all my kids are off the payroll. They're married. And most importantly, our son and our incredible daughter-in-law delivered for us our very first grandchild. And I can report to you that she was an avocado for Halloween. And it was a very, very big day for our family. So to know the Pences is to know a family. That's what we're all about. It really is. You know, President Ronald Reagan was one of a kind. He's universally admired today, but I can tell you, that wasn't always the case. Before he was the great communicator, Ronald Reagan was the great disruptor. He was a conservative outsider who vigorously opposed the moderate Republican establishment of his day. Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980 breathed new life into our party. that changed the course of our nation and the world. I think today we actually find ourselves in a very similar time. As President Donald Trump was one of a kind. Like his predecessor, he too disrupted the status quo. He challenged the establishment, and today, like then, there's no turning back. And under the Trump-Pence administration, we achieved things that conservatives had only been talking about for more than 40 years in the history of this movement. And we did it all not by backing down. We did it by standing strong and not apologizing for our values. And freedom was the anthem of our administration every single day. In 4 short years, I'm proud to report, we rebuilt our military. We restored the arsenal of democracy, and we finally started giving our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guard, and Space Force the resources they need to defend this nation. We revived the economy. We created 7 million good-paying jobs. We cut taxes across the board for working families and businesses. We rolled back more regulation than any administration in history. And we became a net exporter of energy for the first time in 70 years. In addition to that, we held China accountable after years of trade abuses. And we brought jobs back to the USA. We reduced illegal immigration at our southern border by 90%. And the armed forces of the United States crushed the ISIS caliphate, and Qasem Soleimani is gone. Americans were safer and more prosperous in the wake of our administration. But beyond all of that, we also confirmed nearly 300 judges to our federal courts at every level, and they're all men and women who are committed to the God-given liberties enshrined in our Constitution. And that included 3 Supreme Court justices, Justice Neil Gorsuch, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And I couldn't be more proud. I couldn't be more proud to have been vice president in the most pro-life administration in American history. We stood for the sanctity of life every day. In 48 months, our administration achieved the lowest unemployment, the highest household income, the most energy production, the most trade deals, the most secure border, and the strongest military ever. But how times have changed. In 1 year, the Biden-Harris administration has unleashed a tidal wave of left-wing policies that threaten to wipe out the progress that we made. You know, frankly, Democrats have moved so fast, sometimes I feel like the left hand doesn't know what the far left hand is doing. But honestly, it's heartbreaking to see. For all the progress that we made, as we stand here today, now we have the worst border crisis in American history. People are suffering on both sides of the border. Inflation is at a 40-year high. Grocery stores are struggling to keep their shelves filled. And you know, one of the advantages of not being vice president anymore is I get to drive my own car. One of the disadvantages is I get to pay for my own gas. Gasoline prices are up 50% in the state of Indiana. Massive tax increases are being talked about in Washington, D.C., and for those of you with darker hair than mine, I got to tell you, your generation is being saddled with trillions of dollars in debt. Incredible. And overseas, you know, history teaches that weakness arouses evil. And quite frankly, President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan has only emboldened our adversaries. As we stand here tonight, the world awaits. Russian tanks and 130,000 soldiers are arrayed on the border of Ukraine. Iran is accelerating its nuclear program. China continues to tie international cooperation to demands that the world look the other way on human rights, on Taiwan, Hong Kong, and their aggressive military maneuvers. It's truly astonishing. We showed the world that we can achieve peace and stability. but it begins with American strength. And here at home, times have been just as challenging. The American people have seen their freedoms eroded during this pandemic. After promising to shut down the virus, President Biden has instead supported a rolling shutdown of American liberties. After promising not to mandate the vaccine, President Biden tried to mandate vaccines for 90 million Americans. But I'm proud to say that that new conservative majority on the Supreme Court of the United States struck that vaccine mandate down. Now look, I'm proud of the vaccines. I led the White House Coronavirus Task Force. I believe Operation Warp Speed was a medical miracle. We developed 3 safe and effective vaccines in 9 months when experts usually take years to develop those medicines. And I've gotten the vaccine myself, got the booster myself, but I got to tell you what, in a free society, that's a choice every American should be able to make for themselves and their family. And of course, we see the heartbreak. After the last several years where leading Democrats were calling to defund the police, we saw a 30% spike in homicides in 2020. And murders have actually even increased higher during President Biden's first year in office. You know, we don't need to defund the police. We need to defend the police and all of the families and communities that they protect and serve. Men and women who serve in law enforcement are heroes all, and they deserve the respect of every American every single day. But perhaps one of the most troubling developments of the past year has been the Biden administration's wholehearted embrace of the woke left's all-encompassing assault on culture and values. You know, I hardly have to tell conservatives or Stanford College Republicans or any conservatives on campuses in America about the assault on free speech. You know, I was proud that our administration actually issued an executive order that said that every campus in America will respect the freedom of speech or you will not receive federal aid to your campus. But Under the Biden administration, cancel culture is the order of the day. Patriotic education has been replaced with political indoctrination. They abolished our 1776 commission and have authorized the teaching of critical race theory in our schools. You know, instead of teaching our kids to be proud of their country, critical race theory teaches children as young as kindergarten to be ashamed of their skin color. Let me be clear on this point. Critical race theory is nothing less than state-sanctioned racism, and it should be rejected by every school in every state in America. The good news is parents are starting to take our schools back, even here in California. I mean, last year, Republicans won the governorship in the blue state of Virginia, largely on the issue of education freedom. And I got to tell you, I had to read it twice. This week in San Francisco, parents recalled 3 woke school board members who cared more about renaming schools than reopening them. Wow. You know, those results, I got to tell you, those results are sending shockwaves all across the country. I mean, Democrats who've supported cancel culture and school closures are starting to wake up. Truth is, many on the woke left have been spending years trying to agitate for a culture war. It looks like they might just get one. And they're going to lose it. You know, as the Democrats work to advance a big government socialist agenda, I came here to say to each and every one of you, we cannot have a growing economy, we cannot have safe streets and better schools or stronger families by putting more government on top. The antidote is freedom. And so it falls to your generation to stand on the ramparts of freedom, just as many of you have here on this campus to put tonight together. Stand up and be counted on behalf of liberty. In a word, you need to be the freedom generation, and I know you will. But to do that, you need to prepare your minds for action, because these are very serious times. You know, Ronald Reagan said once famously that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. And I have to tell you, when I see the developments in the public debate today, the hostility to conservative thought and traditional values, those words ring more true than ever before. So I want you to do a couple of things. First, wrap your mind and your heart around the founding documents of this country. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are the greatest charters of freedom in human history, and they deserve your attention. I think every American should reflect on the words of the preamble of the Constitution. It's kind of our to-do list, truthfully, as Americans. That our government was created to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. See, that's what our work is. First off, the first object of the national government is to provide for the common defense. I mean, we need your generation to understand peace comes through strength. That border security is national security. And we need each and every one of you, incredibly accomplished men and women who've made your way here to this storied institution of Stanford. We need you all to be willing to think about, reflect on, and maybe be willing to put on the uniform of the United States of America for a time. To promote the general welfare doesn't require growing government. It also means understanding where the general welfare arrives from in a free society. It doesn't come from government. It comes from free enterprise, free markets, prosperity that's created the greatest The greatest wealth in the history of the world in this country derives from our economic system. So promoting freedom and free enterprise is also about promoting the general welfare. Also standing for trade that is free and fair and puts American jobs and American workers first. And also promoting the general welfare means we need to keep standing up to China until they open their markets, stop stealing our intellectual property, and respect human rights. And finally, the Constitution charges us to ensure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We need to be committed to the ideals in the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. We need to reject cancel culture and wokeism and embrace American liberties for every American of every race and creed and color. That's our birthright. To be the freedom generation, we also need to make sure the young Americans have a solid foundation in education. And that means building on the momentum that we see here in California and Virginia and everywhere in between. That means putting parents back in charge of where their children go to school. The time has come for us to let every parent choose where their children go to school, regardless of their income or area code. And we also need to recognize that patriotic education is essential to the survival of liberty. We need you to be the generation that cherishes our history and our heritage. It recognizes that while we were not perfect when we began and we are not perfect today, we are that nation that has ever sought to be a more perfect union. And we'll continue to strive toward that every day, so long as America is. This freedom generation could also be the last line of defense for the Constitution of the United States. You know, for most of our history, both political parties were committed to the ideals enshrined in the Constitution. But in woke America today, that's no longer the case. I mean, we live in a time when the radical left routinely demeans the American founding, wants to push aside the American founders. And today, progressives seek to rewrite our Constitution and erode our liberties. Democrats have actually established a commission to pack the Supreme Court. And every single day, it seems, we see new efforts to silence or cancel those who disagree with the progressive agenda. So my challenge to each one of you is let the Constitution and the Declaration be your guide. Many of you, I hope, will step forward to serve our nation, if not in uniform, maybe in public office, at the local, state, or even the federal level. You know, it's important to note that every office holder in this country takes the same oath: to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. You'll take that obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And you will pledge to well and faithfully discharge the duties of that office. So help you God. I recited that very oath standing at the inauguration on that cold day in 2017, with a hand on my Bible and a hand on Ronald Reagan's Bible. So I encourage you to be a generation that keeps your oath. It takes to heart that pledge. It really is in the heart of every American to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I need you to be men and women who are willing, as the good book says, to keep your oath even when it hurts. As George Washington said, so we must say, the Constitution is the guide I will never abandon. As I close, I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to make a lifelong commitment to become men and women of integrity. You know, there's a common misperception, I think, afoot in your generation, if I can say. It's that adversity creates character. I think the way you put it is, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Well, I happen to think whatever didn't kill you just didn't kill you. Men and women, I'll tell you, adversity doesn't create character. Adversity reveals character. When the hard times come, the criticisms come, you will be in that moment the men and women you have prepared to be in every quiet moment before it. So I want to say to this freedom generation gathered here, particularly to those of you that aspire to leadership, use this time in your life to develop the qualities of the inner man and the inner woman that will make you into the leaders our nation will need and rely on in the days ahead. Study that Constitution. Grow, as the good book says, in wisdom and stature and grace before God and grace before men. You know, people follow people that they trust. So develop a vision. Draw that vision from the American founding and learn how to put it in your own words for your neighbors and your friends. And lastly, I would say, never forget that in these United States, the foundation of America is freedom, but the foundation of freedom is faith. That we are that nation that believes that our rights do not come from a sovereign. They do not come from a charter. They do not come from a book of laws. We believe that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And so I say to you with deep humility, at this time in your life, seek and you will find. And when you find Him, your life will never be the same. You know, we've been through a lot over the last 2 years. Global pandemic, civil unrest, a divisive election, a tragic day in our nation's capital, and now an administration intent on transforming America into a European-style welfare state. But I'm more convinced than ever, looking at most of the shining faces here, that this is a freedom-loving nation. And this freedom generation will lead us to heights unimaginable. That when all of you do all that you can in the time that you've been given, I know that we will preserve this last best hope of earth, and the best days for the greatest nation on earth are yet to come. Thank you all for being here. God bless you. And God bless America. Thank you. Thank you. I think we got some time for some questions. Or maybe not. No, I'm kidding. Please, go ahead.
At this time, we'll be moving to our Q&A segment. If you would like to ask a question to the Mr. Vice President, please exit towards the back of the rows and line up with my two colleagues back here. And now for the first question.
Primarily, I want to thank the Stanford College Republicans for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to primarily meet you before this, which was quite the honor, and also getting to ask this question.
It's my honor. Thank you. What's your name?
My name is Paul Kramer.
Hey, Paul.
So I've worked quite a bit in the nonpartisanship sector. I've advised Republican, Democratic, Libertarian campaigns, and kind of the problem I've seen is just the lack of discourse, right? And you got a very affronting welcome, I guess would be a way to put it here, and kind of, what would you say? I'm the executive director of the largest youth run institute in America, right? Nonpartisan. And guess what? You've seen Republicans, Democrats, you see everybody yelling at each other. What step can all these smart Stanford students, I as a high school junior, and everybody else out there take? To effectively change discourse, redefine the conversation. What can we do?
Well, thanks for the question, Paul. I appreciate it. And let me say, I've often said to people, I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. And people who served with me in Congress knew that. Some of my very good friends in the Congress were names you might know but be surprised by. The late John Lewis and I were very good friends. I co-led the annual pilgrimage to Selma, Alabama. I walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, arm in arm with John Lewis, because we were friends. We shared faith. We didn't agree on much else, but I had great respect for him. Tom Lantos was a congressman from California, the only Holocaust survivor to ever serve in the Congress of the United States. Tom was a liberal Democrat, but he and I bonded on our commitment to support the Jewish state of Israel. And he was a great man. I will agree with you that we're living in challenging times, and it's important to remember that democracy prospers with heavy doses of civility. That we can agree to disagree. And disagree strongly, and we do. And we take our disagreements to the ballot box, and we let the people decide. But I think you put your finger on it, and I expect we'll find it again. That in America, it's important to remember that God gave us one of these and two of these. Let your voice be heard, but listen to the other side. Be respectful, even in disagreement, and we'll move our nation forward. I promise you, Paul.
Hi.
Hi, how do you feel about...
What's your name?
My name is Mohammed.
Mohammed, hi.
Hi. How do you feel about former President Trump's comments that you didn't go far enough to protect the results of the election?
He didn't go what? I can't hear you.
Sorry. How do you feel about former President Trump's comments that you didn't go far enough in order to protect the results of the election?
Well, I spoke about that just a couple of weeks ago. And, I know in my heart that we did our duty that day. We have a system in America of elections that is predicated on the notion that elections are governed at the state level. This actually, if you go back and look at it, in the Constitutional Convention 1787, they